I don't know why I ever agreed to go on that trip. I wasn't the camping type, not really. But something about it felt right at the time. Maybe it was the way the invitation came up so casually. A long weekend, a few days away from everything. Seemed like a good idea then. Now, thinking back on it, I realized how foolish that was. The place was deep in the woods. Not a well-known site, just something my buddy Ethan had heard about. He swore it was great. Secluded, quiet, perfect for getting away. We drove out there late in the afternoon, heading further into the forest than I was comfortable with. The dirt road was narrow, winding, and barely maintained. It felt like we were the first people to go down it in years. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches heavy, thick, blocking out the sky. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun was still up. We parked at a small clearing, just enough room for the truck and a couple of tents. The air was still, too still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. We got out, stretched our legs, and started setting up camp. Ethan seemed at ease, moving through the motions like he'd done this 100 times. I was slower, more cautious, taking in the place, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. We had a small fire going by the time the sun dipped below the trees. The food was simple, canned stuff, some hot dogs over the flames. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Just the occasional comment about how peaceful it was, how this was exactly what we needed. I tried to believe it. The first night was fine. I didn't sleep great, but I never did when I was out in the wild. Too many noises, too many little things that kept me on edge. But nothing happened. Just the usual discomfort of sleeping on the ground, the cold seeping up through the tent floor. By morning, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. We spent the next day hiking. The woods were thick, the trails barely there. If you didn't know where you were going, it would be easy to get lost. We didn't see another person the entire time. No hikers, no campers, not even a sign of anyone else having been there recently. That should have been strange, but we brushed it off. It was what we wanted, right? Solitude. We got back to camp in the afternoon, worn out but feeling good. That night was different. It started with a sound. Not loud, just wrong. A rustling, too deliberate, too close. I sat up, listening. Ethan was out cold. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around. Nothing. The trees stood still, the campsite looked untouched. But that feeling was back, stronger than before, like something was watching. I lay back down, telling myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, a deer, nothing to worry about. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise sent my heart racing. And then footsteps, not heavy, not human, but close, slow, deliberate, just outside the tent. I held my breath, every muscle locked in place. The sound circled the tent once, twice, then stopped. The silence stretched out, unbearable. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making everything feel stupidly normal. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Ethan was already up, acting like nothing was wrong. I didn't mention the noises, didn't want to sound crazy. We spent the day fishing at a nearby stream, trying to relax. It almost worked. Almost. That night, the feeling came back before the sun even set. The sense of being watched, of something out there, just beyond sight. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, just stillness. We sat by the fire, both pretending not to notice. But I saw it in Ethan's face. He felt it too. Then the noises started again. Closer this time. Not just one thing moving, but multiple. Snapping twigs. The sound of something shifting through the underbrush. Low, careful steps, as if whatever it was didn't want to be heard but couldn't help it. I gripped my knife, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Ethan glanced at me but said nothing. We both just listened, and then we saw them. Shapes, just beyond the firelight. Dark figures standing between the trees, motionless. Watching. I couldn't see their faces, just outlines. But they were there. More than one. Maybe 3, maybe more. Couldn't tell. They didn't move. They just stood there. I felt cold. Not just on my skin, but deep in my bones. My body wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I just stared, waiting for them to do something. Anything. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. Like they had never been there. We didn't speak. We just grabbed our gear, threw it in the truck, and got the hell out of there. We left the fire burning, left the tents, left everything. We drove in silence, not stopping, not looking back. Only when we were miles away did Ethan finally say something. "Did you see them?" I just nodded. I didn't need to say anything. He knew. We both knew. We never went back. Never even talked about it again. But sometimes late at night I still feel it. That feeling of being watched. And I wonder if they ever left that place, or if they followed us home. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I wanted to clear my head, get away from work, from the noise of the city. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place I had read about online. It wasn't a campground, just a patch of public land a few miles off the main highway. There was a small, unmarked trail leading to a clearing, and according to the map, there was a creek nearby. It sounded perfect. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a few essentials. My plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp, spend a night in peace, and hike back out the next morning. No distractions, no stress, just me and the quiet of the woods. I reached the trailhead in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, and the air was cool for summer. The hike in was easy, the trail barely used but still visible. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no sign of anyone else. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground, surrounded by thick trees, and the creek was close enough that I could hear the water trickling. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. As the sky turned dark, I ate my dinner, staring into the flames, enjoying the solitude. The woods at night are different. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant snaps of twigs, the occasional hoot of an owl. I've camped before, and I knew better than to let my mind play tricks on me. Most noises are harmless, just the forest being alive. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the inside of my tent. Everything was still. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the random scurrying of an animal. Not the wind. Human footsteps, moving just beyond my tent. I held my breath, heart pounding. I hadn't seen anyone else all day. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers. I wasn't near any popular sites. Who else would be out here? I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I listened, straining my ears, but there was only silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, barely breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe I had just woken up disoriented. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the tent's ceiling, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. The ground was covered in leaves and soft dirt, so I wouldn't have seen footprints anyway. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I had just been on edge, but something about the silence felt wrong. I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small, thin piece of rope was tied around a tree near my campsite. It hadn't been there the night before. Just a loop of dirty, frayed rope knotted around the bark. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Someone had been out here. Someone had stood near my tent in the dark while I was sleeping. Someone had tied that rope. I don't know what it meant. I don't want to know. I just walked away, fast but steady, not stopping until I reached my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. I still love the outdoors, but I won't camp alone again. I know there's nothing supernatural about what happened. There was no ghost, no fairy tale monster lurking in the trees. But that's what makes it worse. Whatever was out there that night was real. I never liked camping. The idea of sleeping outside, exposed to the elements and whatever else was out there, never sat right with me. But I went anyway. My friends had been planning the trip for months, and after enough pestering, I gave in. The drive out was long and mostly uneventful. We were heading deep into the woods, farther than I'd ever been before. The campsite was at the end of an old logging road, one that barely showed up on the GPS. It was the kind of place you'd never stumble upon unless you were looking for it. The deeper we drove, the more I regretted saying yes. We arrived late in the afternoon. The campsite was nothing more than a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. There was a fire pit made of stacked rocks, the remnants of old logs around it, and not much else. No sign of anyone else. No cell service. Just us and miles of dense forest in every direction. Setting up was simple. We pitched our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and unpacked our supplies. As the sun started to sink, the temperature dropped. The silence out here was unsettling. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the snap of twigs as something moved unseen in the underbrush. We sat around the fire that night, eating, drinking, and laughing. The flames flickered, casting shadows against the trees. Every so often, I caught myself staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in on us, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sometime past midnight, we turned in. The fire burned low, just a few glowing embers left as I crawled into my sleeping bag. My tent was small, just big enough for me and my gear. The fabric walls felt flimsy, like a thin barrier between me and whatever was outside. I shut my eyes and tried to sleep. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Something wasn't right. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there listening. The forest was too quiet. No wind. No chirping insects. Just silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching against the forest floor. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too steady. I held my breath. It wasn't coming from my friends' tents. It was beyond the fire pit, just outside the ring of trees. Moving. Stopping. Moving again. I turned as quietly as I could, reaching for the knife I kept in my pack. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripped tight. My heart pounded. I didn't dare move the tent flap. I just listened. The footsteps circled the campsite. One slow lap around us, then another, closer this time. I wanted to wake my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. Whatever was out there, it wasn't stumbling around aimlessly. It was walking with purpose. Then it stopped. right outside my tent. I could hear it breathing, not deep, not loud, but steady, human. I gripped the knife tighter, my hands slick with sweat. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here this deep in the woods in the middle of the night? And why weren't they saying anything? Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so still. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. The footsteps started again, this time moving away. I listened until they faded into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I stepped out, my legs stiff. The fire pit was nothing but cold ash. My friends were still asleep. Everything looked normal, but the footprints were there. Large, deep impressions in the dirt, not ours. Leading from the trees, circling the tents, stopping inches from mine, then heading back into the woods. I woke the others. We packed up and left within the hour. No one argued. No one even spoke. We never went camping again. It was late September, the time of year when the air carries a sharp bite, but the woods haven't yet shed all their leaves. My brother, Danny, had been begging me for weeks to go on one last camping trip before winter. I finally caved, mostly to shut him up, but also because I missed the quiet of the woods. The plan was simple: 2 nights, just the two of us, in a remote area of the Hoosier National Forest. A place we'd hiked plenty of times but never camped overnight. We drove out early Friday morning, reaching the trailhead around noon. The drive itself was uneventful. A couple of small towns, long stretches of road with nothing but trees, the occasional deer darting into the brush. By the time we parked, the sky had taken on that grayish hue that comes before an early autumn storm. We hiked in about 6 miles, farther than we'd originally planned, but Danny wanted to find a spot near the creek. I didn't argue. The sound of running water was always calming, and the more isolated we were, the better. The air smelled like damp leaves, rich earth, and the faint trace of pine. It had rained a few days earlier, so the ground was soft but not muddy. By the time we found a decent clearing, the sun had started dipping behind the trees. We set up quickly, pitching the tent near the water, collecting enough wood for a fire, and digging out the beer we'd packed. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. No work, no obligations, just the woods and the fire crackling between us. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night, unsure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow on the tent fabric. Danny was snoring lightly beside me. Everything outside was still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I strained to hear anything, but there was nothing. Then came the snapping sound. Not the kind a small animal makes. This was different. A slow, deliberate crunch of twigs. Something moving just beyond the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just lay there listening. The steps were heavy, but not rushed. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I wanted to wake Danny, but I didn't want to make a sound. My heart pounded so hard I swore it would give me away. After what felt like an eternity, the steps faded into the distance. I barely slept after that. Every noise, every shift in the wind, made me jolt upright. When morning came, I climbed out of the tent, trying to shake the lingering unease. That's when I saw them. Footprints, large ones, too large to be ours. They circled our campsite, starting near the tree line, weaving between the trees, and stopping just a few feet from our tent. Danny shrugged it off, said it was probably a hunter passing through. But that didn't sit right with me. Who walks up to a stranger's tent in the middle of the night and just stands there? We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the weirdness. The woods felt different, though. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched but can't see by what. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees, something darting behind trunks, just out of sight. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. That second night, I barely slept. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I heard breathing, heavy, deliberate, just on the other side of the tent fabric. I couldn't move, my muscles locked up, frozen with fear. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Morning came and the footprints were there again. More of them, closer. Danny tried to act like it was nothing, but I could tell he was rattled. He wanted to stay one more night. I wanted to pack up and leave. That last night was the worst. The fire barely burned, the wood too damp to catch properly. We sat in silence, listening to the forest. The noises were back, the snapping branches, the slow, heavy footfalls circling the edge of our camp. Then came the smell, a thick, coppery stench like rotting meat. It was so strong I gagged. Danny's face went pale. We packed up in the dark, moving as fast as we could without running. We left behind the tent, the gear, everything. We just wanted out. The hike back was a blur. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on us. The entire time, I swore I heard footsteps behind us, but I never turned around. I didn't want to see what was there. We made it back to the car just as the sun was coming up. We never talked about it, never went back. But sometimes late at night I hear it. That slow, deliberate crunch of twigs just outside my window. I never liked camping much, but when my brother, Jake, asked me to go on a trip with him and a few friends deep in the Montana wilderness, I figured it would be good to get away for a while. He had been planning it for months, going on and on about how untouched the area was, how there were no marked trails, and how the only way to get there was by hiking miles into the backcountry. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he promised it would be worth it. I had no excuse not to go. We left early on a Friday morning. 5 of us packed into 2 vehicles, carrying enough gear and food to last a week. The drive took nearly 8 hours, most of it on winding roads that turned into dirt paths barely wide enough for a single car. It was already late afternoon when we parked at a makeshift pull-off and started the hike. The forest was dense, towering pines stretching up in every direction, the sun casting long shadows through the thick canopy. The hike itself was brutal. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, and every step forward felt like a struggle. Jake and the others were ahead, moving fast and talking loudly about the best spots to set up camp. I kept quiet, focusing on my footing. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the silence became. The only sounds were our footsteps, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant call of birds. No distant hum of cars, no signs of other people. Just us and the wilderness. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was slipping behind the trees, turning the sky a deep orange. We found a small clearing near a creek, just large enough for our tents. It seemed perfect. Plenty of space, fresh water nearby, and a fallen log that made for a good sitting spot around the fire. We set up quickly, getting our tents pitched before dark. Jake was good at this kind of thing, always had been. He got a fire going while the rest of us gathered wood. Dinner was simple, canned food and protein bars, but after the exhausting hike, it felt like a feast. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool night air. We sat around, talking, laughing, the glow of the flames flickering across our faces. Everything felt fine, normal, even until the first night. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, unsure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire was just glowing embers now, barely giving off any light. I could hear the creek nearby, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But there was something else, a sound just at the edge of hearing. a faint snapping, like twigs breaking underfoot. I lay still, holding my breath. My tent was zipped tight, but I could feel the openness of the forest pressing in. The sound came again, closer this time. Something or someone was moving just beyond the campsite. I turned onto my side, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a deep, slow breath, like someone exhaling through their nose. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. A bear at worst. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, waiting for the sound to come again. But it never did. The next morning, I kept quiet about it. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The others were in good spirits, making coffee and talking about plans for the day. Jake wanted to explore the area, see if we could find a good fishing spot farther up the creek. We hiked for hours, the sun beating down through the gaps in the trees. The deeper we went, the more I felt like something was off. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels darting up trees. Just silence. At one point, we found an old, rusted canteen hanging from a low branch. It looked like it had been there for years, covered in rust and dirt. Jake picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Someone must have camped here a long time ago," he said. Nobody responded. We kept walking. That night, the unease didn't go away. As we sat around the fire, I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then, just as we were settling into our tents, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the trees. This time, everyone heard it. Jake grabbed a flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but thick trunks and undergrowth. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, but his voice was tight. We stayed awake for a long time, listening. The footsteps never came closer, but they never went away either. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, we found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the campsite, where the trees started to thicken, there were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet pressed into the damp earth. They circled the camp. No one said anything for a long time. Then, quietly, Jake started packing up his gear. We left within the hour, hiking back the way we came, moving fast, barely stopping to catch our breath. The whole time I felt it, that presence just behind us, hidden in the trees, watching. By the time we reached the cars, my legs were shaking. We loaded up quickly, slamming the doors shut, locking them even though we were miles from anything. We never talked about it again, never reported it, never tried to find out who or what had been out there with us. All I know is that something was, and it let us leave. I don't know why I agreed to the trip. Maybe it was the stress from work or the constant noise of the city. I thought some time out in the woods would help clear my head, help me sleep better. I was wrong. It was early October when I packed up and drove out to the national forest. I picked a secluded campsite, one that wasn't too far from my truck, but still gave me the feeling of being deep in the woods. I wanted space, peace, and quiet. The air was crisp, and the leaves were changing, shades of red, orange, and gold. Felt perfect. Setting up was easy. I had done this plenty of times before. My tent went up in under 15 minutes. I gathered some wood for the fire, unpacked my supplies, and made a simple meal. As the sun started to set, I leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, squirrels rustling through the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Normal things, but as the last bit of sunlight faded behind the trees, that normal feeling started to slip away. The forest got too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind were gone. It was just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the cool air had something to do with it. Maybe the animals just weren't as active. I threw another log on the fire and sat there, staring into the flames. The silence pressed in around me, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. My eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I reminded myself that I was alone out here. There was no one else around. But then something moved. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows between the trees. A shape barely visible in the dim firelight. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to stay calm. Probably just a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up trunks and branches, but nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire. My breathing was steady, but I kept listening. Every crackle of the flames, every slight movement in the trees. I was on edge. Then I heard it. A low, steady sound. Breathing. Deep and slow, like someone standing just beyond the fire's glow. My body tensed. I gripped my flashlight tighter, pointing it toward the trees again. Nothing. The sound stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal shifting in the underbrush. But my gut told me otherwise. I wasn't alone. I stood up, forcing myself to move casually, like I wasn't scared. I grabbed my knife from the side pocket of my chair and slipped it into my jacket, just in case. The fire was dying down, but I didn't want to leave my chair. I didn't want to turn my back on the trees. I let the flames burn lower, just watching, waiting. Then came the footsteps. Not heavy, not fast, just slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. Moving closer. I didn't move. I held my breath. I listened. The sound came from behind my tent, just out of sight. I forced myself to move, stepping toward my truck. I kept my flashlight pointed at the trees, scanning. My truck was only about 20 feet away. If something was out there, I could get in, lock the doors, and leave. I took another step. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the campsite. Nothing. My chest tightened. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, like something rotting. The kind of smell that made your stomach turn. It was coming from the trees. I had smelled dead animals before, but this was different. Stronger, pungent, like decay mixed with something else. Something worse. I couldn't stay out here. I took another step toward the truck, forcing myself to move slowly. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached the door, grabbed the handle, a whisper. Right behind me, too close, a single breath of sound. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. My hand fumbled for the lock. Click. I locked the doors. My chest heaved as I forced myself to breathe. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. No movement, no figures, nothing. I didn't care. I put the truck in reverse, backing up so fast I nearly hit a tree. Then I turned and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up leaves and gravel. My campsite disappeared in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway. My hands were shaking. My whole body was tense. I didn't look back. I don't know what I heard. I don't know what I smelled. But I do know this. I'll never go back to that forest again. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and the night gets too quiet, leave, because something might be watching you. I always liked camping alone. The quiet of the woods, the isolation, the time to just sit and think. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy camping with friends or family, but there was something about being out there by myself that felt different, more personal, more real. I had been planning this trip for a while, just a weekend out in a remote part of the forest, a few hours from home. I picked a spot far from any official campgrounds, away from the usual trails. I wanted solitude, just me, my gear, and the trees. The drive took most of the afternoon. By the time I reached the dirt road leading into the woods, the sun was already hanging lower in the sky. The road was rough, barely maintained, full of potholes and loose gravel. My truck handled it well enough, but I still had to take it slow. The farther I went, the denser the trees became, and the more I felt the weight of my own isolation. That was the point, though. That's what I wanted. I found a good clearing just before sunset. It was a small, flat space surrounded by tall pines, not too far from a narrow creek. It looked untouched, the kind of place no one had camped in for a long time, if ever. I set up my tent quickly, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going. It was already cooling down, the warmth of the fire welcome against the creeping chill of the evening. As I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, I listened to the sounds of the forest. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the dark. Normal sounds, nothing unusual. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just a sense of unease. Maybe it was because I was out here alone, far from anyone. Maybe it was the sheer silence, the kind that felt too deep, too complete. I ignored it. I had camped alone before. This was nothing new. I turned in early, letting the fire die down to embers. My tent was warm enough, and I was exhausted from the drive and setting everything up. I fell asleep fast, the quiet of the woods wrapping around me like a blanket. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. No reason, just awake. My eyes opened to the pitch-black darkness inside my tent, the sound of my own breathing loud in the silence. Then I heard it, a noise, not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate, a sound like movement, footsteps on dry leaves, just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, clicked it on, and pointed it at the tent's thin fabric walls. Shadows shifted with the light, but nothing moved. Maybe a deer, maybe just my imagination. I stayed still, listening for a long time. When nothing else happened, I let out a slow breath and turned off the light. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun filtered through the trees, birds called from the branches. I stepped outside, stretched, and started getting ready for the day. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine. The ground around my tent was soft, slightly damp from the morning dew, and there were tracks in the dirt. Clear, distinct footprints, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of it. I hadn't heard a car. I hadn't seen another person for miles. And these prints weren't old, they were fresh, made sometime during the night. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever had been out here had walked right up to my tent, had stood just feet away from where I was sleeping, then left. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a hunter who had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I tried to enjoy myself, tried to focus on fishing at the creek, hiking a bit, but I couldn't shake that feeling, that someone had been here, that they might come back. When night came, I built a bigger fire. I kept my knife close. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. But when I finally lay down in my tent, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Movement, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I waited. Then, something touched the fabric of my tent. A light, dragging touch. I flicked the light on and grabbed my knife. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice hoarse, rough. Silence. I unzipped the tent in one quick motion, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had burned down low, casting faint flickering light across the trees. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping back and forth. Nothing, no one, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stood there for what felt like forever, my skin crawling. Then, finally, I forced myself to move. I threw my gear together as fast as I could, not caring how messy it was. I put out the fire, doused it with water, packed up my tent in a rush. By the time I was back in my truck, my hands were shaking. I locked the doors, turned on the headlights, and drove. I didn't look back. The road felt longer on the way out, twisting and turning through the dark forest. Every shadow felt like a person. Every movement in the trees made my pulse spike. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, miles away, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never went back to that spot, never even looked up the area again. I don't know who was out there with me that night, and I don't want to know.